What is up, my Plata people? Welcome back to the Periakimai channel, where we are making our way downtown, walking fast, faces past, and we are working through the Answering LDS Truth Claim series now on episode 13, which is going to cover episodes 16, 17, and a bit of 18 from Brett McDonald's LDS Truth Claim series. This section is going to start with something that kind of annoys me a bit, and that's mostly because of the strength with which this point is argued, with how little substance there actually seems to be with it. So this section is called Pride and Costly Apparel in McDonald's Slideshow, and this is an apologetic I've heard pop up in other places, and I just kind of don't get why. And so to really try to steelman this particular apologetic, what as I see it, so there is this description of the within the archaeological record of the Maya people sort of wearing these very costly displays of their wealth, through jewelry, through fine clothes, and that sort of a thing. And this is something that is also described in the Book of Mormon as the people wearing this like really fine apparel, this costly material to display their wealth. The thing is that like wearing your wealth is really common across cultures. I mean, to think of a modern example, you've got like the Gucci handbags and the Rolex watches. That's just like a modern take on that. Like nobility across cultures has worn some sort of symbol to show their social status and their wealth. And so this argument is really just kind of like at best a bit of a nothing burger. Like, if the Nephites actually existed, then like wearing this type of costly apparel to display their wealth makes sense. But it's also something that would just really be like expected and not something that's necessarily unique as an identifier. Now, on the other hand, like at worst, the way that this apologetic is used to sort of like strengthen the idea of like we're meeting this reasonableness standard, or this, what I would say should be a preponderance standard of evidence, but a reasonableness standard is what McDonald argues for. If you're trying to kind of go for that, and you're just taking like whatever possibly hits, whatever spaghetti sticks when you throw it against the wall, like that's what this argument kind of ends up looking like. And so I think that what we should do is actually look at like one of the passages from the Book of Mormon and kind of like see how this actually gets used in McDonald's argument. So we're going to look at Jacob 2:12 through 13, and that reads, "And now behold, my brethren, this is the word which I declare unto you, that many of you have begun to search for gold and for silver and for all manner of precious ores, in the which this land, which is a land of promise unto you and to your seed, doth abound most plentifully. And the hand of providence hath smiled upon you most pleasingly, that you have obtained many riches. And because some of you have obtained more abundantly than that of your brethren, ye are lifted up in the pride of your hearts, and wear stiff necks and high heads because of the costliness of your apparel, and persecute your brethren because you suppose that ye are better than they." Now, according to Jacob 2, where did the Nephites actually acquire the gold? This is going to be important. So where are they acquiring the gold, the silver, and all manner of precious ores? For those who actually like want to take the text seriously, who want to treat the text seriously with what it says, it's obvious that they acquired it from the land, and that the materials are like abounding plentifully in the land. To suggest that they acquired these materials from like another source, such as trade with outsiders, would be like really just to flatly deny what the text itself is actually saying. It would be to treat the text unseriously. So in the next slide, McDonald reflects on a practice of Maya importing exotic goods, which evolved into the use of exotic materials in apparel and jewelry. And McDonald suggests that this particular piece of evidence is going to add some sort of missing piece in Jacob's discourse, and that the acquisition of wealth that the Nephites had is through trade. And that is just pure, unadulterated apologetic BS. Jacob 2 is clear. The land is what abounds in the materials that led to the accumulation of wealth. There is no mention of trade in Jacob 2. Now, this actually ties in with another theme that we discussed earlier in the last episode, that the Nephites, that the Lehites in general, are not described as having contact with any other groups from the time that they leave Jerusalem with Ishmael, from the time that the sons of Lehi go and get Ishmael's family and bring them along, until they run into the Mulekites. And that's all the way down in King Mosiah's line, like several hundred years later, right? Like there is this huge gap of time where the Lehites are not described as having any contact within the text or with another group of people. If this were like all, it's frankly damning enough to the argument that McDonald puts forward. But there's like even more divergence that's baked into this that's going to undermine McDonald's argument further, and that's the materials that are actually discussed. So for Jacob 2, what we're talking about is gold, silver, precious ores. This is how they're accumulating their wealth, and this is a very like metallurgical system of wealth distribution, which makes sense if you're thinking about like wealth being distributed through coins and gold, right? But McDonald's source for like the way that Maya wealth is distributed describes this wealth as being through the importation of obsidian, jade, basalt, chert, and seashells. Like these are like more mineral materials. So it should go without saying that these are like just completely different lists, and that there's not really this alignment between what's described in the archaeological record with the Maya and what the text itself of the Book of Mormon claims. McDonald's next section, metals and gems, is better insofar as it does not completely like misrepresent the text just to create like an apologetic that will actually like stick against the wall somewhere. Instead, it leans into like the vague language of the Book of Mormon, such as the like precious stones, to make a connection to jade. Unfortunately, precious stones is such a broad umbrella term that it can encompass like pretty much any possible like candidate stone to be included in there. So it's actually like entirely useless for identifying a culture. So basically, gets into the idea that sure, the Nephites and the Maya both fit this description of working with precious stones, but so would any other culture that's working with precious stones also fit in with this. Like this guy actually goes like even one step further. Like there's a certain like cultural contingence to this like description of something as being precious. A precious stone in like the Maya culture could be very well different than what a precious stone would be in the Nephite culture. Perhaps what we consider precious stones today, and sort of like the more like Western European, North American culture set, as you may, however you may wish to refer to that. Um, like what we may consider precious stones could just be considered garbage rocks in the future, or by even certain contemporary cultures. Now, McDonald does have a discussion about pearls, and there is like a decent attempt here to be made at like an actual connection. And like this is one that I'm going to grant because I think I actually have been pretty harsh on McDonald on this one. And so, fine, like there is a convergence here between like the pearls, the fine pearls being available to the Nephites in Fourth Nephi, and there being lots of pearls in Oaxaca, and like this kind of fitting those particular locations. Um, so the one issue here is that like the dates that McDonald provides in his own slides here are to create like a 700-year gap between like when these pearls are there, that are described like among the Maya versus when they're described among the Nephites, but stones do tend to last for a while. Really, what this gets us to is like at best kind of a so what, like nothing burger situation, right? And like at worst, what we actually have is that precious stones, pearls, these are things that are mentioned also several places in the King James Version of the Bible, and would be perfectly expected for some author who's familiar with the KJV to have used in the language that they're using in producing a text like the Book of Mormon. Since there's like a certain amount of accepting like textual dependence on the KJV in like the production of the Book of Mormon between like both myself and McDonald's own particular framework for how the Book of Mormon was produced, uh, if we're trying to create distance between like what the actual like evidentiary record is telling us and Joseph Smith as a candidate author, this actually doesn't help McDonald's case. And frankly, the story is pretty much the same for the metals. McDonald shows once more rather reckless disregard for what the text claims for itself, uh, chalking up really like the mentions of iron and steel in the same passages as something which might just be a translation issue. Like this is not really a suggestion that McDonald can substantiate in any meaningful way, but these references to iron and steel in the same passages as like these other materials are problematic. You can call it a translation issue and voila, your problems are solved, but in reality, like this is an issue, and this is not one that his side has really been able to adequately address. So let's move on to polygyny. Honestly, McDonald's points here are mostly fine. I do have some quibbles here and there, but really just one big thing to add in this section. McDonald describes the surrounding social context in which the wealthy outside the Nephite population practiced polygamy, but the practice was forbidden among the Nephites. Jacob, too, however, completely contradicts this idea. I'm a little bit confused, I think, by what McDonald's really trying to argue. The Lamanites, a term which McDonald asserted earlier is just a blanket term for non-Nephites, explicitly did not practice polygyny, according to Jacob. The offensive behavior came from within, not from the outside. And the picture that McDonald paints is one where the culture that he is trying to describe as being Nephite is influenced by an outside culture in order to start this practice of polygyny. And so I think that this is either something in the way that he has presented it and the way that I'm interpreting what he has presented, or it is something that's an important piece of evidence that's against the case that he's trying to argue for. And this is something that if I had an opportunity to talk with McDonald about this, I would like to sit down and kind of hash out a little bit, because it doesn't seem like a very careful reading of the text. So in the next section of McDonald's slides, we have what's titled A New World Fleeing Prophet. And McDonald argues that there is a right place, right time mass exodus due to invasion for his New World geography model. He holds the text quite loosely to accomplish this. And we're going to really need to include a discussion about the people of Zarahemla to kind of really get into that and to connect all these dots together. So this is especially important because McDonald is going to fail to engage with the linguistic imperialism of Nephite refugees. So Mosiah I rolls into the Mulekite community, this group of people that are following Zarahemla, and he declares that the language of the people are corrupt. This is something that is accepted by the Book of Mormon author as being a valid understanding of what has happened to the Mulekite language. And then he compels the people of Zarahemla to learn the Nephite language. Mosiah I then installs himself as the king over both the Mulekites and the Nephites. So there's just this huge, despite the larger numbers of the people of Zarahemla, the Nephites just roll into town, force the people to learn their language, and install their own king as the sovereign over the combined communities. Nowhere in the discussion of the meeting of the peoples of Mosiah and Zarahemla does McDonald really engage with this issue of linguistic subjugation. And what he actually is trying to do is he's trying to show that there are these two groups of people in the archaeological record, these two different language groups that meet, they converge, and they start to have this interchange, this mixing of languages. And that's just not what happens in the Book of Mormon. That's not at all what's described in the Book of Mormon. And then from this section, we start to talk about a lot about war in the Book of Mormon. McDonald lists out some 15 wars, and I think this is actually an undercount. And he suggests that the Book of Mormon is a complex and rich history of a civilization's views and attitudes towards war. What I am concerned about with all of this is that the Book of Mormon doesn't really ever engage with sort of the realistic side of war, such as things like supply chains and how that plays in and how that's used in the strategy of war. So McDonald contends in his Reasons for Warfare that, quote, the nominal causes for war in the Book of Mormon tended to be either rivalry over political dominance or else ethnic bias, often framed in terms of competing belief systems, i.e. religion. That statement is technically correct. It's a little bit misleading. Wars in the Book of Mormon are nearly always attributed to religious reasons. To be fair, the Bible does the same thing as some other similar ancient texts. The Book of Mormon in this respect does a fine job of matching really what one might expect from a text written by ancient Mesoamerican Jews. Now, this does create a bit of a conundrum, though. If we treat the Book of Mormon seriously as a text, it will be quite difficult to find any long-lasting civilization with so many and so frequent religiously instigated wars. Even in Europe, where there's quite a bit of evidence for religious factionalism leading to armed conflict, most wars were fought for reasons other than just the religious ones, and they're given that religious flair to justify the cause to the people. So likely, if the wars of the Book of Mormon are historical, then the text of the Book of Mormon would be more like the histories of the Bible, and just creating these justifications, these religious justifications, this religious myth-making after the fact to justify why these wars started and why the results played out the way that they did. And this would be independent of any sort of true cause that we'd be able to detect in the archaeological record. Now, the Mesoamerican wars that McDonald describes are ones that are largely the results of issues of succession and nobility claims. Were these wars meant to describe the conflicts that characterized and resulted in the eventual extermination of the Jaredites, I would grant that there is a pretty strong noted parallel. However, the wars of the Nephites are not really fought for that. The Nephites kind of like give up that whole issue of like succession right before the war chapters really begin. I mean, really, with like the exception of like the Amalekite Amoron wars, which really are about like trying to insert oneself as king and trying to make a nobility claim that way. Many of the wars in the Book of Mormon are more about sort of these ancillary issues related to religious conflict. But the most common reason given for wars in the Book of Mormon is ethnic conflict with outsiders. In addition, you do have the wars with against like the Gadian robbers and those sorts of situations, which are more about fighting against like mountain gangs and separatists as opposed to really opposing on a succession claim basis. And so you could, like, I suppose, like take like a really broad brush approach to the text of the Book of Mormon and say that like a lot of these Nephite wars have to do with some kind of succession conflict, uh, but the text really doesn't describe them that way. And the issues of succession really tend to be far from the primary causes of war. So in the section titled "Who Fought Standing Army," McDonald begins with like a rather baffling claim. He asserts that because the first use of the word army does not appear in the Book of Mormon until nearly 150 BCE, that the wars before that date must have been little more than raids. And I just don't think that that's a justified conclusion. It's fallacious reasoning, really at its finest. It's an argument from silence. What he's arguing is that because no one said anything about there being an army, there must not have been armies, but that just that conclusion just doesn't follow from the premise. Given how the Book of Mormon authors state that they like have to exclude, especially on the small plays, have to exclude so much content from the record, why would we leap to any conclusions about what like must not have been there because it isn't mentioned? In fact, if we take that particular metric, it's very problematic for the apologetic claim. By that metric, we can quite safely rule out a Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon because it doesn't like have jaguars, cocoa, tapirs, or like other flora fauna indigenous to the region. Of course, McDonald would rightly not accept that conclusion on the basis of such flimsy reasoning. It is worth noting that the flora and fauna that we would expect to find in the text if it were set in a Mesoamerican context is not mentioned. And then when we compare that against like the flora and fauna that is mentioned in the text is not what we would expect in a Mesoamerican setting, it does create a bit of an issue. But again, there's a certain degree of like just because it doesn't say it doesn't mean it wasn't there being fallacious reasoning. So I'm really just pointing that out that like the argument of silence, it's faulty reasoning, and McDonald would be wise to abandon that particular line of argumentation. Now, back to McDonald's argument. So if you take a peek back at the metal section, you'll see that McDonald does like kind of the same thing here that he did back there. Iron isn't mentioned after this date, so it must be that they were no longer working with iron as opposed to any like other possibility. So it could be that the Nephites did not have a standing army. It's possible. But it could be that they always had a standing army, but that mentioning this just didn't become relevant until closer to the war chapters. To suggest that because armies are not mentioned earlier, that it must mean that there were no armies is just a fallacy. Just to reiterate that point. That said, it has been the habit of this series to grant, just for the sake of argument, that what McDonald has to say about a certain thing is correct, and we see what the consequences of that claim would be. So let's grant that the Nephites had no standing army until 150 BCE. At best, this gives us another thin connection to the Maya. But even McDonald notes that standing armies were vanishingly rare in the pre-Columbian New World. Why should we privilege the thin connection to the Maya overthink connections to any other New World culture? In fact, why should we really grant that this has any connection to the New World at all? The next section, called Place of Arms, is really just another tenuous connection. Basically, there's a Maya site on a mountain where they manufactured weapons, and there's a hill called Oneida in Alma 47 that is called a place of arms. It's just another tenuous connection at best. I do think there's a more interesting thing going on here with Oneida. In Alma 47, Amalickiah, fleeing from his defeat in Alma 46, arrives in the land of Nephi to instigate the Lamanites into conflict with the Nephites. The king of the Lamanites assents to Amaleki's instigations, and he sends out a proclamation throughout the Lamanite holdings that the time of war has come. A certain number of Lamanites, realizing just how bad it is to go to war against the Nephites, try to escape. These Lamanites, led by Lehanti, flee to the place which was called Oneida, and this is when they see Amaleki's army coming for them. To elaborate, disobedient Lamanites residing in the land of Nephi escaped to a place called Oneida explicitly because they did not want to encounter the Nephites. They just wanted to be left alone. Curiously, with the first mention of Oneida in verse 5, there is a footnote that cross-references over to Alma 32:4. In that passage, Alma is speaking to some people who had been ostracized by the Zoramites. We are told in Alma 31:3 that the Zoramites reside in a land called Antionum, which is east, just to the east of Zarahemla, south of Jershon, and just north of the wilderness. Alma fails to find converts among the Zoramites, and so he hangs out with the ostracized people that are on the outskirts of the city, preaching to them on a certain hill, and that hill is called Oneida. Now, is this hill the same Oneida as in Alma 47:5? I find this dubious. For one, that there is no indication in Alma 32 that the hill Oneida has any sort of industry for militarization. For two, why would the Lamanite rebels flee toward the Nephite lands when going further south would more likely afford them sanctuary from the coming conflict? And then finally, there's a problem of topography. So, like Oneida in Alma 32 is a hill, and Alma 47, Oneida is a place, which includes a mountain called Antipas. In verse 7, we read that those who had fled to Oneida had gathered themselves upon the mount called Antipas. So, does it make sense for this thing that's called a hill to include a mountain? Now, the reconciliation here is that there are just two completely, totally separate Oneidas, the hill and the place. If this is the case, then the Nephites and the Lamanites completely independently produce the same name for two completely different locations. This would be unusual, though we can certainly consider it not impossible. Nonetheless, it is a peculiarity that would also fit well with the idea that a first-time author was putting together a story and kind of got a bit lost in the sauce. So for the goals of war, McDonald draws another connection between the common objectives of subjugation and control in the Book of Mormon with the objectives of war observed in Mesoamerican conflicts. Of course, this runs into the same sort of like so what problem that's been really the refrain of this episode. Find me an ancient culture where the primary objectives of war are routinely different. This just is not a point that is of any benefit to either side, except perhaps to show just how much McDonald really is taking that apologetic spaghetti and throwing it against the wall to see what sticks. Perhaps talking about the seasonality of war will provide stronger ties. After all, this should be dependent on the location, on the geography, the topography, and where in the world the Book of Mormon is actually set, right? By now, you should really already know where this is going. McDonald argues that Alma 53:7, where Moroni, after taking the Lamanite stronghold of Mulek, pauses his advance for the rest of the year to regroup and replenish his forces, as well as to provide for the civilian population. McDonald suggests that this is evidence of there being a sense of seasons of war tied to the agricultural schedule of the Nephite holdings. But that's in contradiction to verse 8, where we learn that continued Lamanite incursions are happening in Moroni's absence. Essentially, verse 7 gives us the account of one specific contingent of the Nephite military. It is not really a treatise on what's going on with the entire force. The Book of Mormon is largely unconcerned with seasonality in warfare. However, let's grant, again, just for the sake of argument, that there is seasonality. Would that somehow serve as evidence of the authenticity of the Book of Mormon over and against sort of like naturalistic models? Well, no. When this topic comes up, my mind is drawn to the story of Valley Forge, which would have been quite recent history for Joseph Smith. The idea that fighting happens at some times of the year and less so at others would not at all be unattainable to the young Joseph. McDonald's further points on this topic really do nothing more to vindicate his position. In fact, he spends more time adding to the text than he does actually dealing with what the text has to say for itself. And at this point, we may as well just kind of cruise the rest of this. If there's anything that McDonald has to argue that, like at its strongest, could really rise above a tenuous connection to the known data about ancient Mesoamerica, then we'll explore that more in detail, but otherwise breezing through McDonald's presentation. So in the discussion about armor, we do kind of get this idea that like there's these terminology differences and how armor is described in the KJV and how it's described in the Book of Mormon. And like this could give some space for there being differences between Near Eastern and Mesoamerican armor styles. It could also indicate an author trying to align with, but just making some tweaks to KJV terminology, and to kind of help keep those connections working while showing that this work that they're producing is unique and distinct. on their own. So really, at best, in this situation, we kind of hit a wash between the critical and apologetic positions. Next, McDonald presents two different geographic correlations where words no longer mean what they mean so that McDonald can make the text fit his model. Issues with directions were interrogated in the last episode, and they remain a problem for any Sorensen-style model. Reconciliations only work if you no longer allow the text to speak for itself. So for the section entitled Animals, we get another tenuous connection that is founded upon an argument from silence. Basically, even though the Book of Mormon anachronistically discusses animals that have been used in war, as well as chariots, no chapter of war speaks on the role of animals or chariots in conflict. Mesoamerican wars were largely absent animals and chariots, therefore connection, right? But does this meaningfully separate models of historical authenticity from naturalistic models of production of the text of the Book of Mormon? In this case, consider that the role of animals, though not entirely removed from the wars of Joseph Smith's time, played a diminished role with the advent of gunpowder. Mounted cavalries had a diminished role in the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and the stories of war that would have been most proximate to Joseph Smith really would not have had much in the way of descriptions of these great cavalry and chariot charges, but really more of commanders leading ground forces to victory through stratagem and cleverness. And what do we see in the Book of Mormon? Commanders on the ground leading their forces through stratagem and cleverness. So again, at best, this point really serves as another, as with the rest of this discussion, a wash between the naturalistic and historical authenticity models. So jumping into the next section on weapons and swords, this has McDonald arguing that one of the most blatantly ahistorical events in the Book of Mormon is actually consistent with the evidence. And for that, we have to jump all the way back to the Old World and go to the murder of Laban. We sort of jumped over this story when talking about the Old World apologetics section, and I was sad about that because this is one of my favorite stories, honestly, for showing that the Book of Mormon is not entirely historical. And to support that, I'm going to make this statement very bluntly. The story of Nephi slaying Laban is fiction. Even if the rest of the Book of Mormon is historically authentic, that story is a fictional tale. We can roll it into the reading of Nephi 1 as ethnogenesis and move on about it. There are so many major problems with the story that we can even accept the idea that the sword of Jericho is an acceptable piece of evidence that steel swords, like what the sword of Laban is described as being, would have been technically feasible during the reign of Zedekiah. I am fine with that. This story has so many other problems. First, let's deal with the moral problem of God commanding someone by quoting the future words of Caiaphas to execute an unconscious person. Thou shalt not kill gets thrown right out because it becomes instead, it is better that one man should perish. Of course, there were so many other ways of handling this situation. For example, the Lord could have sent an angel to Zoram, commanding him to take the brass plates outside the gates where he would be led to a land of promise ahead of the coming destruction. Or he could have ensured that Laban's drunken stupor was so significant that he would remain unconscious through the whole night, with a massive hangover the next day, affording the Lehite sons and Zoram sufficient time to escape before Laban could even command his 50 people to pursue. So many other solutions were available to the all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing creator of the universe. But apparently, according to this story, all he wanted was the blood. And that leads to problem the second, the blood. Assuming Nephi could actually accomplish the task, there is going to be a massive amount of blood to deal with. Given how close Nephi would have to be to Laban to do the actions described, he is going to be covered in it. But worse, when Nephi pulls this whole Hitman Agent 47 routine and changes into the costume, switching into Laban's clothes, those clothes are going to be blasted with blood. Nephi is giving Laban the most extreme bloody nose imaginable, and that is going to leave a trace. So we then have this absolutely blood-soaked Nephi strolling into the treasury, speaking in Laban's voice, and Zoram is just the most chill dude about this. And then finally, made a little bit of an allusion to this. We need to talk about the mechanics of decapitation because I don't think Nephi could actually do what's described in the text. Decapitation is not easy. even with like a weapon like purpose built for the job. You need really good positioning, leverage, weight, a clean cut. These are all needed in addition to having the right tool for the job. Like, mess this up, things get messy fast. In fact, this is like actually a plot point in the series Shogun. So Nephi claims to have never killed a man before. If that's the case, we have plenty of reason to doubt that he has like the skill necessary to perform a decapitation. Certainly lacks the experience. Nephi is also far too close to Laban to get the proper leverage needed to make a proper strike. There is no strength in swinging a sword close to the body, which is what would have to happen if he's only holding like Laban's head out like arm's length by the head of the hair, and making a proper strike or making a strike at a proper angle at at that position. That just ain't happening. Now, this story just didn't happen. It's not even that it like lacks historical basis. We can just look at what the text has to say for itself, critically assess what the text presents, and it becomes apparent that this story could not, and indeed did not happen as described. The story that we are given is fiction. And this again goes back to what I said earlier. It's fine to say like the rest of the Book of Mormon is historical if that is a position that you come to by the evidence. This story is not. It is fiction. But McDonald is just content with saying that holding the head by the hair is a good way to keep the head from moving. It, tr- True enough, I suppose. Now, now that this series, that the LDS Truth Claim series, is in fact one of the best series for making it like a positive apologetic case for like the within LDS apologia, is not it's not a very good reflection on the state of LDS apologetics overall. I don't really blame McDonald for that. He is honestly doing the best that he can do with the resources that he's given. So McDonald continues this section with recounting Ammon's rapid succession of amputations while defending Lamoni's flocks. This story is at least technically possible, but the idea of a single man standing against like an entire raiding party like this is more fantasy than reality. Fighting multiple opponents at one time is incredibly difficult, even if you are fortunate enough to like control the space and funnel them into a bottleneck. Ammon appears to be in a field where the flocks are able to graze. So the story really doesn't afford him much opportunity to really control this battlefield. Instead, either the account is fiction or his attackers are just like absolute morons. However, unlike the Nephi slaying Laban, this story is at least technically possible, and so I can't say that it is just out and out fiction. Finally, for this section, at least my engagement with it, McDonald discusses the idea that staining a sword, as described in Alma 24:12, makes more sense if the blood could have been stained, like, or could have stained like some wood instead of like the metal. This assertion, I think, is just silly. I think it's just a silly reading of the sword. So, first, steel swords can be stained with blood in the form of corrosion. And that happens when a sword is not properly cleaned after being used. Stainless steel would hardly need to be a thing if, like, the phenomenon of correct, steel corroding, steel being stained, were impossible. There's actually even an achievement in the video game Sifu called Sword Stained with Blood. So it seems like the metaphor actually extends beyond the Book of Mormon. But this is just a reflection of how McDonald treats evidence. It isn't just him, and he isn't the worst offender. This is really just a problem that's rampant in apologetics. There's more in the section of weapons, but I'm moving on because like McDonald has sufficiently burned any trust in that section for like the handling of evidence as far as I'm concerned in engaging with it. So fortifications are up next. Basically, McDonald rushes right past any concerns about the connection to the mound builder myth and points out that sometime the Maya had fortifications where they moved earth around and they also built a wall at some point. At best, this gets us to a wash again between the naturalistic and historical authenticity models. The fact that McDonald doesn't really like engage with the mound builder myth here. I'm kind of annoyed with how he's really handled evidence throughout this presentation. I got to give the point overall to the naturalistic camp on this one. So McDonald makes some big conclusions about the Book of Mormon passing some test of historical reliability. However, I found that his treatment of the evidence was really just poor throughout this section. I find his conclusions to be unwarranted at this stage in the discussion. It's deeply rooted in fallacy and falsehood. It really feels like when he's not employing an argument from silence, he's using the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. he misrepresents throughout, like the text and the evidence. And that's really what I have for this one. Like, unfortunately, about this point in the series, McDonald starts to get less consistent in presenting the arguments and showing how they've been updated up to this point. It does happen from time to time. It's not as consistent as he was earlier in the series at doing that. I do know that he does have the arguments fully fleshed out altogether, so we will get that walkthrough at some point. It might just be closer to the end of the series, but we'll see how it goes going into the next episodes. And again, thank you so much for watching this one. I hope that you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, do all the fun YouTube things, and I will catch you in the next one. Later.